Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Smoke rising from Russian oil refineries is becoming a familiar image, but it's also a metaphor for an economy under pressure. Now, with growth stalling, profits plunging, and labor shortages intensifying, President Vladimir Putin is now demanding answers from his own economic team. Now, for more insight, we're joined by Tomasz Kasprowicz, Editor-in-Chief, Publica Nowa. Good to have you with us. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, so looking at this contraction, 1.8% of the Russian economy, is this a temporary slowdown, or is this the beginnings of the end of the Russian economy?
Oh, the beginnings of the end were much earlier than that. This is the first symptoms of it. Last year's economic growth in Russia was almost exclusively due to the increase in military production. The military production that was almost immediately blown up in the Ukrainian fields. So while it looked great as a statistics, at the same time, it was actually of no benefit to the economy or citizens of Russia. So beyond statistics, this didn't translate to well-being of the citizens. Even more so that the benefits coming from the war, and there are such, were channeled to a very narrow group of people, while the rest was burdened with facing the cost.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tomasz, you mentioned this war economy of Russia's. Has this now reached its limits? Is that the only reason, or what are some of these other underlying factors here that are contributing to all this?
Well, first of all, of course, it's the war, the contraction of the labor force, as you already mentioned, the problems with monetary policy, because Russia decided to pay a lot to the soldiers to avoid dissent and the general upheaval in Russia. They are paying the soldiers very handsomely. And the poorest citizens, especially in the regions, find this an opportunity to live themselves out of poverty. And those people found their incomes grew about sevenfold. One would think they would use the money to improve their conditions of living, but that was problematic as well, because the Russian economy was not producing anything of value for the citizens, because it was producing mostly for the war. So the government had to find a way to stop people from spending the money. This led to the interest rates being as high as 19%, now they're about 17%, to make people keep the money in the banks, promising them huge interest. And that's why we didn't see such a huge inflation in Russia yet. But at the same time, such a huge interest rates mean that all of the companies that want to invest and borrow money cannot do so because they are unable to get such a big returns to repay those loans. Also, this translated in a very hard position for people that already had loans, variable rate loans, because their installments grew rapidly, and this also translated into the wave of bankruptcy. So this was a large hit also from this perspective. Mm-hmm. Of course, this situation of the economy must be much worse than what we see in the statistics, because, of course, we know those are not true. Those are manipulated to show what the Kremlin wants us to see. Now we can see that the situation must be so bad that they have to admit there is a recession. It's probably deeper than this 1.2%, but the Putin knows that he cannot pretend anymore that everything is fine and according to plan, and he needs to find people guilty of this situation that are not himself. And that's why the ire against, for example, central bank, which is actually a pivotal institution that managed to keep Russia afloat for as long as it did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly on that note, I was going to ask you about that, because this very public rebuke of Putin, I mean, he's always trying to show that he's in charge, everything is fine. But what do we make of that? You said, interest rates were pivotal. Is this maybe some more of does this give us a sense of internal strife within the Kremlin? As you said, he's looking for someone to blame, or is there something more behind all this?
Nabulina, a very good central banker, as I said, managed to prevent the collapse of Russian economy at the beginning of the war when it was hit from many sides and the sanctions. She actually wanted to resign when the war started, but the Putin did not allow it. And that was quite wise move from his side. But at this point, he needs people to blame. She is not very well connected in the sense that she controls large assets or is very politically well positioned in the hierarchy. So she is a likely candidate to take a fall, or at least some sort of blame for the current situation. I don't think Putin will be keen on replacing her anytime soon, unless the situation is much worse than is it now. She is quite a convenient scapegoat for the problems, but not the one to be killed off prematurely, both because of her usefulness and the high probability that there will be more bad news coming, and Putin needs to reflect that towards somebody.
Let's also talk about more bad news, as you mentioned. Bad news for Russia as well. We've seen many of these attacks on oil refineries, Ust-Luga, Primorsk, etc. Big hit on the infrastructure and revenue as well. How much does that contribute to this downturn?
Ukrainians call it kinetic sanctions, and I think this is a pretty good name for it. This is a huge hit for Russia in general. All of those attacks on productive infrastructure of Russia, it's estimated that Russia lost property of about 7% of the total. So that's a very significant portion. Russia will need to spend enormous amounts of money just to rebuild what was destroyed or neglected during the war. Just to come back to the pre-war levels, Russia will have to spend every year about 5 to 10% of GDP, which is unsustainable, taking into consideration that GDP is growing. To be honest, the Russia has its economic problems right now. Those are now alleviated a bit by increased oil prices, which Russia cannot use to the full extent because of those hits that do not allow them to produce as much as they would like to. But those long-term problems are there to stay, and they will manifest in its entirety when the war ends, actually. And if the sanctions are still in place, we can expect the huge crisis in Russia at the end of the war, when the war economy will no longer be something that Putin can explain. And then either we can expect another war to keep war economy going, or huge changes in Russia.
Let's also stick with energy for a moment longer. We also have the data from Rosneft. I mean, looking at their profits down about, I think, 73%. Now, is that because sanctions are finally biting? Is that, or more structural in terms of interest rates? Is it both?
Well, sanctions are very important. Let's not underestimate sanctions. Of course, sanctions are not enough to collapse the Russian economy, but the system that was put in place put enormous pressure on the profitability of what Russia was doing, on the discounts. This, unfortunately, is very quickly eroded by current geopolitical situation in Iran. And this is something we should be worried about, because now the discounts on Russian oil are shrinking, and this gives at least temporary relief to Russia's budget that was in a really bad shape just a month ago. But this doesn't solve any underlying problems of Russia as they are, and this may prolong the war for another month. But it's not a long-term fix for the structural problems.
Yeah, and looking at structural and long-term as well, looking at what the central bank has said, labor shortages, I'm quoting here, are a new reality. So, I mean, what's behind this? Mostly the loss of war. I mean, also how we counter that with very low unemployment figures from Russia, which is, I think, around 2%. So explain that a little bit to us.
Oh, there are a couple of things going on simultaneously. Firstly, it's of course the demographics. That's the problem of, well, most of the countries in the world. The large post-war cohorts, generations are retiring. The young are not as numerous. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, of course, that about 1 million men were lost in Ukraine, and there is another 500,000 still in the military. So that's another drain. Three, we had a huge outflow of people, especially the very well educated and skilled, at the beginning of the war. That's another million, more or less. So those are those problems. And again, the end of the war will probably not solve it because the people that will return from the war will be demoralized, traumatized by the war, and also expecting very high wages that they were receiving during the military operations. So we can expect that the shortages of labor will not cease after the war. They actually might get worse. The only thing that Russia can do is to induce migration. But this is, again, problematic, especially now after many cases when Russia was actually forcing migrants to go to war. And people are much more wary of going down there now. Whether they will be more inclined to move to Russia after the war, that's hard to say and depends a lot on the situation, economic situation and political situation in Russia then.
Yeah, so giving us this compounding of problems there for Russia, and it's going to be crunch time more and more. Look, thanks for all those insights. Good to have you with us. Tomasz Kasprowicz, Editor-in-Chief for Publica Nowa. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.